If you stand today at the corner of Cheapside and Bread Street in the City of London, you are surrounded by glass towers, investment banks, and coffee chains. The pavement is clean. The air smells of nothing. The street is wide enough for taxis and delivery vans to pass without slowing. Nothing about it suggests that 700 years ago, you would have been standing in the most intensely alive, most densely crowded, most dangerously human place in England. You would have been ankle-deep in filth, pressed between timber-framed buildings so tall they blocked the sun, listening to the roar of 10,000 voices trading, arguing, praying, and dying within an area barely 1 square mile across. Medieval London is gone. Not partly gone. Almost entirely gone. The Great Fire of 1666 burned it to ash. 13,200 houses. 87 parish churches. The greatest cathedral in England. The Guildhall. The Royal Exchange. 4 days of fire erased a city that had taken 6 centuries to build. What rose in its place was brick and stone and order, the London of Christopher Wren, of neoclassical domes and widened avenues. The medieval city, with its wooden bones and narrow lanes and church spires bristling like a forest, simply ceased to exist. But here is the strange truth. The skeleton is still there. Beneath the surface, under the foundations of modern offices, the street plan of medieval London survives almost intact. The lanes still curve where they curved in the 13th century. The ward boundaries still follow lines drawn before the Norman conquest. The livery companies still meet. The Lord Mayor is still elected by aldermen. And if you know where to look, fragments of the old wall, the old gates, the old churches rise up through the modern fabric like bones through skin. This is the world we are going to rebuild. Not from imagination, but from archaeology, from manuscripts, from the testimony of those who walked these streets when London was not a global capital, but a walled medieval city of wood, mud, ambition, prayer, disease, and fire. To understand what medieval London actually looked like, you first have to understand its shape because the shape explains everything. The city occupied a single square mile on the north bank of the River Thames, roughly the area now known as the City of London. It was bounded on 3 sides by a wall, and on the 4th by the river itself. The wall was originally Roman, built around 200 AD, but the medieval city maintained it, repaired it, and depended on it. It stood approximately 18 feet high and ran for roughly 2 miles in a ragged semicircle from the Tower of London in the east to Blackfriars in the west. Beyond the wall was a protective ditch, remembered today only in the street name Houndsditch. 6 great gates pierced the wall, each one a controlled threshold between the city and the outside world. Beginning in the west, Ludgate, closest to the river, opening toward Fleet Street and the road to Westminster. Then Newgate, the largest, leading north and west toward the countryside. Aldersgate, added around 350 AD, giving access to the northern roads. Cripplegate, named possibly for the crippled beggars who gathered there. Bishopsgate, pointing north toward the road to York. And Aldgate, the oldest, the eastern gate, facing the Essex marshes. In 1415, a 7th gate, Moorgate, was cut through the northern wall to give access to the marshy ground called Moorfields, where Londoners practiced archery and, in winter, strapped animal bones to their feet and slid across the frozen fen. Every evening at curfew, these gates were shut. The city sealed itself. No one entered or left until dawn. Inside the walls, roughly 80,000 to 100,000 people lived at the city's peak around the year 1300. That figure made London 3 times the size of York, the next largest English city, though still smaller than Paris or Venice. But the critical fact is this. All of those people with their animals, their workshops, their markets, their churches, and their waste were packed into an area you could walk across in 20 minutes. The density was extraordinary. The pressure was constant. And the result was a city that looked, sounded, and smelled like nothing the modern mind can easily reconstruct. Let us enter through Aldgate, coming from the east, as a traveler would have in the year 1300. The gate itself is a stone structure, heavy and fortified, with a chamber above where a gatekeeper lives. You pass through a short tunnel and the city opens before you, but it does not open in the way you expect. There is no grand vista, no wide avenue. The street narrows almost immediately. Buildings lean inward from both sides, their upper stories projecting out over the road on timber jetties, each floor extending a foot or more beyond the one below, so that by the third or fourth story the buildings on opposite sides of the street nearly touch. In some of the narrowest lanes, they do touch. You are walking through a tunnel of wood and plaster, with a strip of sky above you no wider than your outstretched arms. The ground beneath your feet is not paved, or if it is, the paving stones are buried under layers of compressed mud, straw, animal dung, and household waste. Chamber pots are emptied from upper windows, sometimes with a shouted warning, sometimes without. The central gutter, called the kennel, runs down the middle of the street carrying a slow stream of liquid refuse toward the river. The smell is the first thing that would strike a modern visitor, and it never relents. It is a compound of wood smoke, human waste, rotting food, animal carcasses, and the sharp chemical stink of the trades, the acrid fumes from the tanners, the iron reek of the slaughterhouses, the sour fermentation of the breweries. The city of London in the Middle Ages was, above all things, an assault on the nose. But the eyes adjust faster than the nose. What you see is color and movement. The timber frames of the buildings are dark oak, but the plaster between them is often lime-washed white, or occasionally painted in ochre, red, or pale blue. Shop fronts are open to the street, their wooden shutters folded down to form counters on which goods are displayed. Signs hang from iron brackets above the doors, painted with images because most people cannot read, a gilded key for a locksmith, a striped pole for a barber, a bunch of grapes for a tavern. The street is full of people moving in every direction, on foot, on horseback, driving carts loaded with barrels or firewood. Apprentices call out the quality of their master's wares. Dogs root through the refuse. Chickens scatter underfoot. The noise is incessant, a layered roar of commerce, argument, and daily survival, punctuated at intervals by the bells of the nearest church, of which there is always one within earshot, because there are more than 100 churches crammed inside these walls. That number bears repeating. By the 12th century, there were over 100 churches within the walls of the City of London, one for approximately every 300 inhabitants. They were not large. Many were tiny, scarcely bigger than a modern living room, squeezed between houses and shops, their small stone towers or wooden steeples rising just above the roofline. But they were everywhere. You could not walk more than a few hundred feet in any direction without encountering one. Their bells structured the day, calling people to prayer at the canonical hours, marking curfew, announcing deaths, warning of fire. They were the city's clock, its alarm system, and its conscience, all at once. But above them all, dominating the skyline with an authority that is difficult to overstate, rose old St. Paul's Cathedral. It stood on Ludgate Hill, the highest point within the walls, and it was enormous. Construction began after a fire in 1087 and continued for over 200 years, the architectural style evolving from heavy Norman Romanesque to soaring English Gothic as the decades passed. When the building was finally completed around 1314, it was one of the longest churches in the world, 586 feet from end to end, longer than the cathedral that replaced it after the Great Fire, longer than any church in England today. Its spire, a timber frame sheathed in lead, reached approximately 489 feet into the sky. For a time, it was the tallest structure in the world, surpassing even the Great Pyramid of Giza. The interior was equally staggering. The nave, known as Paul's Walk, stretched so far that it became a public thoroughfare, a place of business, gossip, and social display. Merchants struck deals in its aisles. Lawyers met clients near its pillars. News of wars, plagues, and political upheavals passed from mouth to mouth under its vaulted ceiling. The stained glass was said to be the finest in England, the East End rose window so famous that Geoffrey Chaucer referenced it in the Canterbury Tales, knowing his London readers would understand the comparison. The shrine of St. Erkenwald, a 7th-century bishop, drew thousands of pilgrims each year, its surface adorned with gold, silver, and precious stones. In 1339, 3 London goldsmiths were employed for an entire year simply to rebuild the shrine to a higher standard of beauty. If you walked east from the cathedral, down Watling Street and toward the river, you would pass through the commercial heart of the city. Cheapside was London's Great Market Street. Its name derived from the Old English word seep, meaning trade. It was the widest street in the city. Down the center ran the market itself, rows of stalls, semi-permanent booths, and open counters where goods from across England and across Europe were bought, sold, weighed, and argued over. The organization of the market was visible in the street names that survive to this day: Bread Street, Milk Street, Poultry, Honey Lane, Wood Street, Ironmonger Lane. These names are a record of medieval trade geography, marking where specific goods had been bought and sold for generations. The guild system organized nearly every craft and trade in the city. The mercers dealt in fine textiles. The grocers handled spices and imported goods. The drapers traded in woolen cloth. The fishmongers controlled the city's protein source. The goldsmiths assured the purity of precious metals. Each guild had its own hall, its own hierarchy, its own chapel, and its own fierce territorial pride. Cheapside was where these guilds displayed their power. On feast days, the street was transformed. Conduits that normally carried drinking water ran with wine. Processions of guild members in their distinctive livery marched behind banners embroidered with their coat of arms. The Great Conduit, built in 1236, brought water from the Tyburn River through underground channels to the middle of Cheapside. It was the city's stage. South from Cheapside, the character of the city changed. The lanes narrowed further. The smell sharpened, because here were the wharves and the loading docks. The Thames was London's connection to the world beyond the walls. Everything the city needed came up the Thames: grain from Kent, wool from the Cotswolds, wine from Bordeaux, timber from Scandinavia, spices from the East. The two most important docks were Queenhithe and Billingsgate. Queenhithe handled most of the city's upstream trade, while Billingsgate became the hub for seagoing trade and the most famous fish market in Europe. London Bridge was the only bridge across the Thames. The stone version was completed in 1209. It rested on 19 massive stone piers that acted almost like a dam, creating dangerous rapids between the arches. Shooting the bridge was a terrifying experience, but it was what stood on top that made it extraordinary. Houses and shops lined both sides of the roadway, some 4 or 5 stories tall. The roadway between them was sometimes only 12 feet wide, creating a dark tunnel. At the southern end stood a fortified gatehouse where the severed heads of traitors were displayed on iron spikes, preserved in tar. A chapel dedicated to St. Thomas Becket occupied the center of the bridge. It was a road, a shopping street, a neighborhood, and a fortification all in one. At the eastern end of the city stood the Tower of London, begun by William the Conqueror in the 1070s. Its central keep, the White Tower, rose 90 feet above the surrounding buildings, its walls 15 feet thick. It was designed to awe and terrify Londoners. The Normans had conquered Saxon England, and the tower was the physical expression of that conquest. In the centuries that followed, the complex expanded into a concentric fortress with royal residences, a treasury, a mint, and a menagerie of exotic animals. For ordinary Londoners, it was a reminder that their city's freedoms existed only because the crown permitted it. Beyond the walls lay Smithfield, an open field where the livestock market was held. Every Friday, horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep were driven through the streets and sold here. But Smithfield was also an execution ground. Heretics were burned here. Traitors were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Across the river in Southwark lay a haven for licensed transgression. Taverbs, bear-baiting pits, and the stews clustered here, outside the city's strict jurisdiction. Prostitutes known as Winchester geese operated under the authority of the Bishop of Winchester. Southwark was London's shadow, where the city's desires were met out of sight. A typical London house was a timber-framed structure, 3 or 4 stories tall, built on a narrow plot. The ground floor was usually the workshop. The upper floors contained the living quarters. Privacy did not exist. Families and apprentices shared rooms. Heating came from an open hearth, and smoke escaped through gaps in the roof. Diet was based on pottage and bread. Ale was the universal drink because water was contaminated. The working day began at dawn and ended at dusk. At curfew, fires were covered, Gates were closed, and the city plunged into total darkness. Night was dangerous, and fire was a constant terror in a city built of wood and pitch. In 1348, the Black Death arrived. Carried by fleas on rats, it moved through the crowded city with apocalyptic speed. London's population was cut by half. Mass burial pits were dug outside the walls at East Smithfield. The plague returned in waves for 3 centuries, shaping laws and religious life. Yet the city endured and rebuilt. By the 15th century, London's population recovered slightly, and trade flourished again. The guilds reasserted control, and the city became tougher and more layered. This was the London that lasted until the early hours of September 2nd, 1666. At around 1 o'clock in the morning, a fire broke out in Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane. A strong east wind blew the flames through the tightly packed timber buildings. For 4 days, the fire burned. It consumed 80% of the walled city. 13,200 houses were destroyed. 87 churches vanished. Old St. Paul's Cathedral was gutted. Its lead roof melted and ran down the walls in streams. The medieval city was erased in 96 hours. London was rebuilt in brick and stone, but on the same medieval street plan. Today, you are still walking on top of that lost world. The ground level has risen, burying the old foundations. Beneath the pavement, archaeologists find Roman tile, medieval pottery, and fire-blackened timbers. The street names, Bread Street, Milk Street, Ironmonger Lane, are memorial plaques of a vanished economy. Medieval London is not gone. It is the skeleton. It is the ghost in the geometry of the streets, the memory encoded in the names. If you listen carefully on a quiet morning, standing at the corner of Bread Street, you can almost hear the bells of 100 lost churches ringing through the glass.